This week on Off the Air, Mike Moriarty.
Welcome to our latest edition of Off the Air, the podcast diving into the legacy of WFUV Sports with some of its most prominent alumni. I'm Jimmy Sullivan, joined by Dylan Balsamo, and we are pleased to welcome to the show Mike Moriarty. He is a game reporter currently for AP Radio, CBS Sports Radio, and Fox Sports Radio, covering some of the local teams, and a graduate of Fordham, class of 2005. Mike, good to have you on the show. How are you doing?
Thanks for having me on, guys. I really appreciate it. It'll be fun to talk about this.
So, Mike, I want to start with where we are now with the pandemic and what we're dealing with now. How different has it been for you to cover games? Obviously, no locker room access. What has that experience been like for you over the past year and change?
Totally different, obviously, in terms of the access that we're getting, the relationships that you're building on a daily basis, whether it's post-game, pre-game, going through, basically doing this, being on Zoom with a player. Teams are kind of choosing, unless you really, are stringent on what players are available, kind of who is a top player of that game they pick, go through that way. You're not really roaming around a locker room. So in terms of, I've been at some games, most times at home recently, and it's been super different, but, good in terms of, getting access to where you need to. Everything's recorded. You're not missing anything. So if you need to, used to be going back from one locker room to the other, especially if it's not a highly covered game or something like that, where you don't have a lot of reporters at a game, but you can kind of help each other out, going from the LeBron locker room with the Lakers and running back to the Nets locker room and making sure that you get Durant or whoever. You're not really missing anything. Most teams are recording everything, archiving it on their media websites now. It's just become super easy to access everything. So that's been good. But definitely no more, you ask your questions that you ask, and, that's pretty much it for your night. You're not, you're not too many follow-ups warranted. The way that some of the teams give access is a little different. So, but overall, it's totally different not being at games either. I mean, I'm really not at as many games as I was. There was a time where I could be at 4 or 5 games a week. And it's, it's totally different. Even when I am at games, obviously it's just kind of doing this, sitting in a press box, watching a game, covering the game, taking down your notes, and, logging into the Zoom, and, you ask whatever questions you can, hopeful that other reporters that are, well seasoned, that have been there a long time, or are there every single day, are asking the right questions too. And, figuring out your audio packages and your sound bites that way.
Mike, thank you again for coming on the show. We really appreciate it. I'm really curious about, when COVID first hit, early March of 2020, that first week must have been incredibly strange. I'm very curious of what that first week or so was like for you, and especially since you cover so many things nationally. Excuse me.
Yeah. I just remember, it's a great question, Dylan. I remember the first. I was having breakfast with my 4-year-old at a diner, and I was scheduled to cover the Big East that night on the Wednesday night. And that's when they had the half St. John's game that just stopped. And but it was weird because literally everything else had been canceled that whatever Tuesday night. That's when the Rudy Gobert diagnosis came in Oklahoma City and all that kind of stuff. So for the Big East, I was still scheduled to go to New York that night and do that. And, everything totally changed, everything stopped. And that was kind of how it worked for me. And then in terms of the game coverage, the stories kind of pivoted to how are teams dealing with COVID? Do teams have anybody with COVID? So, and again, it kind of automatically moved over to the Zoom portion of it before seasons were canceled, obviously. And then the moving on to the July restarts in the NBA. Games there were then obviously games to be covered, and I was covering the stuff down in Disney from my couch, and those sorts of things, and baseball obviously restarting and all of that. But the start of it was so strange to just have, my normal schedule was, 10, 15 years of Big East. If there's any local NCAA first round, if there's an East Regional here within the New York, Brooklyn, Philly area, be there. and then go on from there, then move right into the baseball season and kind of go on, so on and so forth. So that it totally changed things. And it, not being at games really from middle of March through whatever that was. I mean, and again, not being a game, really the first game I was at, I think was, I went to one of the first Yankee games just to see how it was, or one of those workouts when they had that summer training deal. And then even being at that, with the temperature checks and, that's before obviously vaccines were around and things like that. So it's just totally changed. I really haven't, in terms of the coverage of games, football, I was at some of the games this year, which again was, the whole questionnaire deal and stuff like that. But, it was definitely strange not being at any arena stadium from March through essentially about, July or August.
Talking with Mike Moriarty on the Off the Air podcast, WFUV alum, class of 2005. Let's get into your time at WFUV. Obviously, you got to do a ton of different stuff, covering games, basketball broadcasts, football broadcasts. I want to go back to when you first decided you were going to come to Fordham. We're recording this in early May. A lot of, high school seniors around now decide where they want to go to college. How much, if anything, did you know about WFUV, about the program at WFUV Sports when you made your decision to ultimately attend Fordham?
When I made my decision to attend Fordham, I knew it existed. I knew WFUV radio existed. I thought I wanted to be a sports writer. And I went, I applied to colleges kind of that way as well. I applied to Fordham too. My dad always told me about Fordham. Thought it was great. The only reason I really knew about the radio station was kind of two-pronged. I knew that they did sports because I heard, the first prong is that my dad listens to Kill McGill, the Irish show on Sundays. So I knew that it existed that way. And then I knew for whatever reason the radio was on a Saturday. And I think it was either, I don't think I officially heard one-on-one, but I think I heard a report essentially from, I want to say it was from the Subway series or something like that I knew. And I heard, I want to say it was maybe Andrew Bogus or something like that. Andrew Bogus, WFUV Sports as the tagline. I'm like, wait a second, this isn't like, somebody nationally at the AP radio. This is somebody that works for WFUV and is at the Subway series. Like, what is even going on there? And then I got into Fordham, started that first, week of August in 2001, saw the club fair, saw it on Eddie's Parade, and then just went from there, went to the first workshop. And I knew that it existed. Again, I didn't know how far reaching it did exist in terms of what was available. I figured it was football, basketball, play-by-play, which that's pretty much, and some women's basketball games at that time was pretty much it in terms of Fordham game coverage. But then I had no idea about the beat reporter stuff at all, and how much Bob Aarons, which obviously everybody that does this show or has anybody from about the late 90s on has dealt with, and it has been our mentor and been terrific to all of us, given us the access. I mean, there's so many times that he fought for our access to games. I mean, you guys will know the history of even before I was there getting, like one Mets credential a week or something like that. And now, you guys are traveling, covering the All-Star Game and World Series and things of that nature. But yeah, I didn't know, I guess, the far-ranging reach of WFUV Sports, but I knew somewhat about it. But I knew I wanted to do it once I realized that, I could be on the air or do something there when it was back on the third floor of Keating. So,
Mike, I want to ask you about something that I think happens to every person who comes through the FUV Sports department, is that you try out everything that is an option to you, and there are certain things you come in knowing you really want to do, and you kind of answered this, but things you really want to do, and then you go, oh, maybe that's not actually for me. Then you try something where you had no idea you would even have liked that. So can you tell us about your experience of trying everything and finding different things that you enjoy?
Yeah, it was, I really tried to be, try to just dive into whatever I could, even as my years went on, going to game coverage, going into back. I think the first thing I ever did on air was as a freshman, probably later in the year. There was a story or a movie surrounding Joe Louis and Max Schmeling, their boxing match in Yankee Stadium. And there was a backstory of it. At that time, Bill Gallo, who was a cartoonist for the New York Daily News, had done some stories around it, was at those fights and did that. And Bob was, really into that story. And I love boxing. And that was really my first avenue into being on air. I did a small piece on a one-on-one when I was a freshman. So that I definitely like the on-air portion of it, but then, learning how to cover a game, how to use a microphone and a recorder, it seems so far away, and technology-wise so crazy that learning how to use a recorder and a microphone when everybody has an iPhone now and things like that. But learning how to do that, cutting highlights was the first thing that many of us. I saw Joe Bono's interview doing this, and that was one of the first things he had said he did was cutting Yankee playoff highlights, cutting Fordham football highlights when they were good and won the Patriot League. So learning how to use that, you're learning how to use an audio editing system, because I didn't have knowledge of that. Most of us didn't, and learn how to do that. Cover a game, be professional at a game. I don't think I got a chance to cover a game maybe until my summer of freshman to sophomore year, but life in the minors, covering a baseball team every day, Staten Island Yankees, Brooklyn Cyclones. And then the technical side, more so for me on the field side, learning how to engineer a game on the field and how that sets up and how to connect back to the station. It was a way for me in, and even before that, again, it seems archaic, but the spotting stats slot when I was whenever a freshman, and the Fordham football was really good, and they liked having somebody do that, and I was happy to go. And I think at that point, when we played in the Patriot League final and did that, I offered to do spotting and stats, and travel with Mike Yam and drive up there the day after Thanksgiving and we did them when they played Northeastern in football in a playoff game, and then Northeastern in basketball at night, which, those sorts of experiences and, learning how to do that sort of thing, but more so, on the technical side, the field engineering, you get to games that way a lot sooner too. You get to be a part of games. You get to go on, if there's somebody needs an opening in a pinch and you're able to go, you're able to travel with the Fordham basketball team and, get experiences like that. And, from that, it kind of branched off into doing color commentary and, sideline reporting and all things like that. But it's totally, it's really what you make of it, and learning how to do everything there. It's totally the best idea to just branch out. I mean, many, obviously the lineage of, Papa and Breen and Carino and Spiro and Ryan and everybody, a lot of them probably go in there with the mind of, hey, I want to do this play by play, but all of them learned how to do a lot of different things too. Obviously they all excelled extremely well at that. But it's great to learn and know how to do a lot of different things. And I definitely think I tried to take advantage of that. And I think most of our class did that, especially, our class was a big class that came through there for whatever reason in 01 or 02 as we came through. And, we all seemed to just kind of branch out and do as many things as we could.
Mike, you've referenced Bob Aarons on a couple of occasions. And as you said very rightly before, everyone who has worked for an extended period of time at WFUV over the last 20 or 25 years has, a Bob Aarons story, usually stories, plural. What are some of those for you? What were some of your fondest memories of getting to work with the great Bob Aarons in your time at WFUV?
Just learning different things, sitting there on a, in the grand scheme of things, a Life in the Minors report on a 3-hour one-on-one show. What's the importance of it? I don't know, but but to go through that and make sure that you fine-tuned it, make sure that you had, I think at the time Andy Stankiewicz was the manager of the Staten Island Yankees. Make sure that you had the correct out cue on a soundbite, making sure it sounded right. Making sure everything kind of really sounded professional, and nothing, if you ever listen back to really anything, obviously you guys are at a whole nother level than we even were, but if you really listen back to any of the pieces that we did, they're so professionally done, because Bob would sit there when we would go through, he would hear something and you would have to edit it. So stories like that, sitting in a really small studio, going through your piece, waiting, to kind of go through and see what he thought, see how your voice was, obviously seeing how you intertwine maybe some music in or things like that. So stories like that. And just, he was so selfless, I guess is the word, in terms of his time. It was never about him ever, which I think was totally helpful to all of us that have ever went through there, is that all he cared about was making sure that we got the opportunity, and then we did whatever we did with that. But making sure that the WFUV was there, got its success, its, all of its member success, all of its student success, and do it, as best as we could. But I think, and also just the funny stories of of being at different games with him. When he would show up and help out in terms of production, doing our live Yankee Stadium yearly show, and him helping out, and really but he was such an intent listener, and he would just be really proud of us if we ended up doing a good job. And so I think there's a lot of special things. Obviously, everybody can talk for hours about Bob, but special things that I would say are the amount that he really was an advocate for us, and the amount that he pushed us to just chase different opportunities. I mean, crazy coverages, and obviously sometimes it was always on our own dime, but it was totally worth being at these experiences and having these experiences on your resume, because it does help you excel both in your sports career and in your regular career as well.
Mike, obviously in this industry, internships are such a big part of the experience, especially here in the New York area. Now, you mentioned to us that you were one of the first interns in that first intern class at SiriusXM radio, which must have been crazy. But I'm curious, I want to ask you about, I think there's a lot of people who would think the future of sports media, or any media in general, was not in audio. But I think XM radio and podcasting really proved us all wrong on that.
Yeah.
That's something you noticed. Can you tell us about your experiences there?
When we it was just it was a crazy experience to be there, and then we all basically stayed after too, did some sort of work after there. So it was, and everybody, I think, because everybody's still within the industry or sports industry. I mean, I'm myself, I do a regular full-time business development job, and then I do this on the side, and have a beautiful wife and 4 beautiful daughters. So it's not I'm not Mike Breen, clearly, in terms of the success that I've had with that. But everybody else that was a part of that intern class is still, Nick Costos was one of the first interns there. He obviously he stayed on there for years and then did that. And now does his great shows with the gambling on radio.com. Nick Andresizian, who I did a lot of work with. He's the head video guy for football at the University of Missouri. And Sean Butler is still at SiriusXM to this day. He's the executive producer for their NBA channel. So the success that I saw there it was just, I'm not sure if there was a big investors or whatever, but the production value and the technology that they had on 2 floors on 6th Avenue and 49th Street was crazy in terms of so many different sound booths, so many different stations. Obviously, I think they were, aided by a couple big acquisitions like the different leagues and having all their play-by-play games and all that stuff, which is really what we kind of did at the start, and then helped out on talk shows, and then obviously gaining some big talk show names and things like that. But when it first launched, I thought it was just, kind of another thing. And it was certainly another thing in New York for us to do, whether as a free intern or eventually turn that into a small job or whatever we did. I was obviously open to it. The 4 of us, primarily, we worked at SiriusXM NFL radio. So that was what we did. And so that was kind of the sports tie-in with that. But I didn't foresee that. I guess it's now almost 20 years later that SiriusXM would be the giant that it is. And, still, and honestly, at that point, it was 2 different places, Sirius and XM, that were kind of competing. And now, 20 years later, for it to be in most people's cars, most people do listen to it or have some sort of access to it. And then, undoubtedly their recorded interview shows. And I mean, no matter what, the fingerprints of SiriusXM and satellite radio and radio in general are all over the podcasting, boom, that is currently taking place. So I didn't foresee, I didn't know, certainly didn't know what podcasting was back then, but I didn't foresee, this kind of, that basically that satellite radio would still be what it is today, and even so much bigger than it is. So.
Certainly on in my car, that's for sure, Mike. And I'll bring up this point because you've referenced a couple of times that the people you worked with, whether it was at FUV or Sirius XM, in terms of WFUV, what was your relationship like with a lot of the people who you worked with, the upperclassmen, people who were younger than you? What were some of those special relationships like for you when you were a student at Fordham?
I mean, it was a lot of my major friends were from the station. We, whether we were covering games, we would just constantly find ourselves at the station when it was on Keating 3rd, and just kind of be there. When we do have some free time, we wanted to, be a part of, kind of that experience, kind of be around. But yeah, I mean, I I spent a lot of summers. I lived on Fordham campus covering the Yankees and Mets for 2 years, for a very nominal fee to live on campus. And, me and another guy who's still, within the sports space in some respect, he does the Yankees and Mets scoreboard is Pat Reichart. And we covered the Yankees and Mets for a summer of 2002, 2003, when we were putting together the 100-year Yankee anniversary show. Basically, we spent, all of our time together. We would hang out, have fun in the summer in the Bronx, and then go cover the Yankees and Mets every day. So it wasn't, and be on the air and do our sportscasts and things like that. So, a lot of my major friends at Fordham came from the radio station. Still to this day, we still, are super friendly. We talk a lot, especially when we see each other at games. And then, in terms of the upperclassmen, underclassmen thing, it was always great. Even as a freshman or sophomore, being just spotter stats or field engineer, it was never like who's this new guy? It was always, I think I was, Andrew Bogish, Mike Yam, Spiro, Spiro and I were never even in school together, and I would see him when he first got his first couple jobs at the Nets and stuff like that. And he would treat me like, he knew us forever. So all things like that is, it really is a brotherhood and sisterhood, certainly, of people that all really just wanted to do well and, figure out a way to keep the flame going in sports and, be involved with it. And, I think, I do value all the relationships from, obviously from my Fordham University experience, but also my FUV experience totally.
Something I'm really curious about is, especially considering how much national stuff you've done, what is the difference, would you say, between the New York media market and national media markets? Is it the fans? Is it just how big it is? What is it that makes New York so different?
It's the fans. It's, not now it's a little bit different because most cities do have a sports radio station. But certainly if you listen and you're on the road or anything like that, the passion is probably not as much. I mean, certainly the Northeast, New York, Philly, Boston, Chicago, to some respect, people are still crazy rabid fans. I think, the amount of media, that's the biggest thing too in a locker room, even on a random Yankees Tigers Thursday afternoon game, we got 20, 30 reporters. And this is obviously before COVID, but you're in a pregame, at least 15, probably 20, 25 reporters trying to chase who the next day starter is. Hey, does Gardner have a twinged ankle? Something, whatever it is. And every small thing, every little notebook item, and, the competition, I think, again, I was never a sports writer, but the competition that always seems to be, they're friendly, the writers that are there every day, but certainly they want to beat each other to, the punch in terms of the Post, Daily News, things like that. The national events are less, they're obviously bigger stage but less intense in terms of, I think, questions, covering a major, again, WFUV gave us access, and Bob got us in to do live shows as 18, 19, 20-year-olds at the US Open Golf, right? I mean, it was crazy to even say that. We had our own booth. We did shows there all week. We did a live show on Saturday. And, you're sitting in interview rooms with Tiger Woods at the height of Tiger Woods. And, you're hearing questions asked. And again, they're very general questions, I think, in the national sense. The amount of, face-to-face access that you're getting is a lot different at a national event, even when the national event takes place here in New York, certainly, whether it's an all-star game, NBA, baseball, the Belmont, that sort of thing, different events that were there. But, I think the intensity for a New York fan, the New York media market, the thirst for every single piece of information on New York teams and things that take place in New York is great from the fans. But I think, in terms of the national, it's definitely a different, when I do work for, a lot of times I'll work for visiting cities that do come in, Chicago, Miami, Boston, things like that. You could just tell, which towns are really into what they need, and, the other towns that are just kind of like, okay, we just need some reaction from the game, when, a town like Boston is totally like, we want this reaction from, we need to ask the coach this question, or we need to ask the manager this question. You can get an answer like that. So you could definitely tell, but it's really good experience. WFUV allowed us to go to a lot of different things, both locally, obviously local games, national events. And even towards the end of my time at Fordham, we were going to basically everything. If you look at our summer schedule for some of our one-on-ones, it was crazy. What we were literally all summer, we'd be at either a US Open tennis, golf, some PGA Tour event here, the Hall of Fame, just crazy about it. The Belmont, when it was a Triple Crown, things like that. So,
Mike, before we let you go, and this might sound a little corny, but I'm going to ask the question anyway. If you could go back and tell, 18-year-old you one thing as you went to Fordham, as you embarked on your journey at FUV and then throughout your professional career, what would it be? Whether it's advice, maybe, anything you do differently, what would that be?
advice would be just to make sure that you get experience in everything. Make sure, and that has to do with radio, but also in general at Fordham, make sure that you experience a lot of things. Make sure that you enjoy your time, but work hard, study hard because it does matter. And, be able to really just do a good job, and know that you're kind of building the building blocks for what the rest of your both professional life, personal life will be. There's a lot of different interesting things that may happen and things like that. So I think advice would be to just make sure that you experience a lot of definitely professionally, a lot of different situations and a lot of different skills and techniques. And, just make sure that you make sure that you work hard, because you're going to end up having to work hard a lot in life. So you got to, while Fordham is awesome and fun and great in that respect too, and socially and professionally. But it's a great building block for the rest of your life. So definitely a great place to be.
Mike Moriarty, game reporter, Metro Networks, AP Radio, CBS Radio, Fox Sports Radio, and a member of the WFUV fraternity from the class of 2005. Mike, thank you so much for the time today. We really appreciate it. Best of luck with everything going forward. And again, really appreciate the time.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.